He was born in a forum thread, June 2009, a Photoshop contest on a website known for strange humor and digital horror. The challenge: take an ordinary photo and make it subtly unsettling. One user, Victor Surge, posted an image of children playing. In the background, a tall, faceless man in a black suit, unnaturally thin, arms too long, limbs crooked like bent antennae. The caption beneath read like a case file: a mystery, a memory. That was supposed to be the end of it. A one-off post, a clever entry. But the internet didn't let go. Something about that image gripped people. Others began submitting stories, more photos, fake newspaper clippings, footage. Panic. Slender Man spread like mold beneath wallpaper, slow, quiet, inevitable. He became a shared hallucination, a myth born in real time. But then something strange happened. The stories grew darker, more detailed, more specific. People began dreaming of him. Children described him without ever seeing the meme. A girl in Ohio refused to enter the woods because the suit man lives there. In São Paulo, a security guard claimed to see a faceless figure standing beneath a streetlight for 4 hours. No movement, no eyes, just presence, and always the feeling of being watched. Slender Man was supposed to be fictional. Everyone knew that. He was made up, provably time-stamped, born on a message board. But the belief didn't care. It gave him weight, roots. History began forming backward. Stories started surfacing from decades earlier. Old journals, oral folklore, scratched drawings from long-dead cultures of tall, pale men who lurked near trees, who took children, who appeared in silence and erased not just bodies, but memory. Skeptics called it retroactive patterning, an example of the mind rearranging history to fit a new fear. But others weren't so sure. What if we didn't create him, but called him? What if Slender Man didn't originate on the internet, but found a signal strong enough to ride into collective consciousness? A way to wear a face in a digital age? Because if you stare into his story long enough, the timeline begins to twist. The more you trace his roots, the more they slip from your fingers. And if you go deep enough, you'll find people who swear he's always been here. That the forest just stopped hiding him when we stopped pretending the woods were safe. Welcome back to Tales from the Forbidden Library. Tonight, we follow a myth made real, or perhaps a reality dressed in myth. Because Slender Man was never just a meme. He was a mask. And the question is, what was waiting behind it? Slender Man, as we know him today, began as a joke. A user named Victor Surge uploaded 2 black and white photographs to the Something Awful forums in June of 2009. The images were simple. Groups of children captured mid-play, framed like found footage. But each had a haunting detail added, an impossibly tall, faceless figure lurking in the background, his arms impossibly long and his body cloaked in what looked like a black business suit. Below each image, Surge wrote fabricated captions describing mysterious disappearances, referencing something called the Slender Man. It wasn't just a clever hoax. It was captivating. The thread exploded with user contributions, more doctored photos, short stories, invented testimonies, and fictional reports. It became a collaborative myth-making engine. Within weeks, a character born in a meme thread had evolved into a full-blown urban legend, spreading across forums, YouTube series like Marble Hornets, creepypasta archives, and eventually into video games and documentaries. What made Slender Man different from past internet monsters was the speed and scale of his mythos. Most folklore grows slowly, passed down in whispers or books. Slender Man grew in weeks, his character design, abilities, and psychology shifting in real time. In some versions, he stalked forests and kidnapped children. In others, He could control minds, induce hallucinations, or force his victims to commit acts of violence. He had no voice, no face, no known origin within his own story, and that made him infinitely adaptable. The myth thrived because it left gaps. Every absence became an invitation. A blank face is an open canvas, and users filled it with their own fears. The stories became self-reinforcing. New contributions referenced older ones. Patterns emerged. He appeared near forests, near institutions, near forgotten places. He targeted the lonely, the lost, the mentally vulnerable. People began claiming to see him, not just online, but in real life. He stepped from story into sight. Digital folklore had never behaved this way before. It wasn't just passive consumption, it was participatory belief. Readers became writers, viewers became documentarians. Each person who engaged with the legend helped it evolve, reinforcing its presence. The myth became modular, fractal, growing in all directions at once. And the more people interacted with him, the more real he began to feel. Psychologists coined terms like shared narrative delusion to explain the phenomenon. But for some, that language didn't feel sufficient. There were too many coincidences, too many dreams shared by people who'd never spoken. Some folklorists suggested that Slender Man wasn't a creation, but an accidental invocation, a modern tulpa, a thought form brought into cultural being through concentrated focus and fear. The idea took hold that the Slender Man was more than a hoax, that perhaps the collective belief surrounding him had allowed something to step through. Not necessarily a single being, but a pattern, a mask, an archetype, something old, wearing something new. The suit was modern, the fear was not. And still, it grew. People reported seeing him in their peripheral vision. Children spoke of him without ever having been exposed to the stories. In one case, a 10-year-old in Ireland drew a picture of a tall man in the woods. When asked why, she simply said, "Because he's been waiting to come back." It's tempting to dismiss all of this as hysteria, as digital myth-making taken too far. But if Slender Man is just a product of the internet, why did so many people begin experiencing him beyond the screen? And why, as we'll see in the parts ahead, did things turn so dark, so fast? Long before the Something Awful forums, long before Photoshop or creepypasta or YouTube horror series, there were stories. They didn't call him Slender Man, but they described something close. A tall figure, unnaturally thin, faceless, or with features too vague to remember. A presence near the edge of the forest, a watcher, a taker. A being whose arrival meant forgetting, vanishing, or worse, being remembered by something you didn't want to know your name. In 16th century Germany, woodcuts by an artist named Hans Freckenberg depict a looming man in dark robes with elongated limbs standing among panicked villagers. The figure's face is smooth and undefined. No contemporary texts explain his meaning. Some art historians believe he was symbolic, the personification of disease, war, or famine. But local oral traditions told of a grossman, or tall man, a being said to punish children who strayed from the village. He was not simply a cautionary tale. He was described as silent, pale, and drifting just out of reach, much like what we now call Slender Man. Further east, in Romanian and Moldovan folklore, there are stories of the faceless shepherd, a figure who walks the forests at twilight, guiding no sheep, whispering no words, but always staring, always present. Shepherds claimed their dogs would refuse to move near certain trails. Children spoke of dreams where he stood by their windows. In some villages, parents nailed crude, faceless masks to trees as wards, a sign that someone was already watching and needed no replacement. In Brazil, the homem do saco, or bagman, is often used to scare children into obedience, a man with a sack who takes away disobedient kids. But in remote regions, his description shifts. He is said to have no face, only a smooth, stretched mask of skin. Locals report that he is not always carrying a sack. Sometimes he simply waits, beneath trees, behind fences, in old schoolhouses where no one has entered in years. Even in Appalachian folklore, among communities isolated by geography and tradition, there are mentions of the stick man or long shadow, an entity that does not move unless you blink, who appears during times of grief, who grows closer each time you remember a specific dream. One tale warns never to walk between two trees at night if you see a shadow that's too tall to belong to anything living. Not because it will follow you, but because it already has. These stories were fragmented, regional, passed down in whispers. No unified narrative ever formed. And yet the archetype persisted. The same shape, the same silence, the same effect. Vanishing children, blank memories, and an overwhelming sense of being observed by something that should not be aware of you. It's as if the same presence was being remembered across borders, under different names and different warnings. Skeptics argue that these connections are retroactive, that the popularity of Slender Man caused people to reinterpret older stories through a modern lens. But what if it's the other way around? What if the meme was so successful not because it was entirely new, but because it resembled something deeply buried, something already living in the collective unconscious? An echo we hadn't heard in a while, now reawakened by the perfect combination of image, suggestion, and digital fire. Folklore isn't always invented. Sometimes it resurfaces. Sometimes a name is forgotten, but the shape of the fear remains. The faceless watcher, the tall figure at the edge of the trees, the one who waits without breathing, without speaking, without blinking, until someone acknowledges him. And then he comes closer. As Slender Man's legend grew, so did something darker, less public, less playful. Beyond the meme, beyond the YouTube series and game mods, there began to surface instructions. Not just stories, not just sightings, but rituals. They didn't appear on the front pages of popular forums. They weren't part of the mainstream creepypasta community. They existed in corners of the internet where usernames meant nothing and posts disappeared as quickly as they were made. Archive logs show threads titled things like "He Comes When You Ask Twice" or "Dream Sigil Experiment, Attempt Number 6. Their contents were cryptic: drawings in salt, candles facing east, instructions to walk into the forest with no flashlight and no shoes. The line between roleplay and belief began to blur. In one of the earliest known examples, a user detailed what they called the proxy path. The idea was simple but unsettling. Write a letter confessing your deepest fear, burn it at exactly 3:33 a.m., and then leave a mirror in the woods with a candle behind it. According to the post, if done correctly, the next time you dream, you'll find yourself in a hallway with no end. Slender Man won't appear, but you'll feel him. And when you wake, there will be ash on your pillow. Other accounts described dream sigils, strange, abstract symbols drawn from nowhere, recurring in the dreams of people who'd never met. One researcher collected 20 such symbols from anonymous users. When he overlaid them, they formed a shape. A tall figure with many arms, no face, and something like a spiral where the chest should be. The researcher later deleted his blog without explanation. His final post simply read, "It's not the stories that summon him, it's the remembering." Some users began reporting side effects after reading too much about Slender Man: headaches, insomnia, sleep paralysis. While skeptics called it suggestion, others believed it was activation. They claimed the more you learned, the more he learned you. That understanding his shape, his pattern, or his name too deeply invited something that didn't need to walk, only to wait. To be seen was to be chosen. Among the more disturbing developments were tales of children inventing their own rituals. not from online forums, not mimicked, completely original and eerily specific. A 7-year-old in Nova Scotia reportedly drew a symbol in red crayon on her closet door every night for a week. When her parents asked why, she said, "So the tall man won't forget that I already belong to him." They assumed it was imagination. But months later, the same symbol appeared carved into a desk at her school, with no explanation of how it got there. This is the point where the myth stopped being entertainment for many. The rituals were no longer about fandom or fiction. They became about control, power, submission. Some believed that Slender Man wasn't an entity at all, but a thought form, a tulpa, created and fed by collective focus. And like any entity fed by belief, he could grow stronger, not through worship, but through fear. There's a reason most of these rituals are no longer shared openly. A reason some forums wiped entire threads without record. People began reporting things they couldn't explain. Whispers in static, corrupted images, voices in dreams that said, "You're not forgotten." A few users went silent entirely, deleting all traces of their posts, as if trying to erase a trail they'd come to regret making. What's most unsettling is that no ritual ever promised reward, no power, no wish, no revenge, only a single repeated outcome: he will notice you. And if Slender Man is just a meme, just a fictional mask for shared anxiety, why would people still fear being noticed? Because maybe it's not about what he is, it's about what wears him. On May 31st, 2014, two 12-year-old girls from Waukesha, Wisconsin, lured their friend into the woods. They had planned it for months, researching, plotting, choosing the knife. They believed that if they killed her, they would become proxies of Slender Man. Not just followers, not just believers, servants. They thought he would allow them to live in his mansion in the forest, that he would watch them, protect them, reward them. All they had to do was prove their loyalty. The victim was stabbed 19 times. She survived, crawling to a nearby bike path where a passing cyclist found her. The two attackers were arrested hours later. When questioned, they spoke of Slender Man with reverence, fear, obedience. They claimed they didn't want to kill, but they had to. If they didn't, Slender Man would hurt their families. They believed he was real. The trial made headlines around the world. It was shocking, tragic, unfathomable. Experts were called in, psychologists, digital historians, folklorists. Some called it a case of untreated schizophrenia mixed with online obsession. Others labeled it shared psychosis. But a deeper layer haunted the investigators. How had a fictional figure, one with a documented origin, become so real in the minds of two children that they were willing to kill for him? In court, one of the girls described dreams where Slender Man stood at the end of her bed. He never moved, never spoke. But she said she knew he wanted her to do something, and she was afraid not to. The other girl told officers that she saw signs, animals staring too long, shadows shaped like arms, her computer freezing on images of trees with no leaves. He was getting closer, she said. What disturbed authorities wasn't just the act itself. It was how many others came forward afterward. Parents reported children whispering about Slender Man in their sleep. One boy in Oregon refused to go to recess, claiming, "The tall man with no eyes watches the jungle gym." In California, a girl drew spirals and trees over and over, saying it was how he sees. What began as a myth became something that looked suspiciously like a haunting. In the months that followed, digital investigators began combing through old threads, and they noticed something chilling. Certain posts, ones detailing the most obscure rituals, the darkest sigils, had vanished, not deleted. Gone. Archived versions showed empty gaps, 404 errors where text used to be. Forum owners denied removing them. In some cases, the original posters had disappeared from the internet entirely. Conspiracy theories erupted. Some believed government agencies were quietly scrubbing dangerous thought forms from the web. Others insisted that Slender Man had never been fictional, that the meme was just the door he walked through. But the most unnerving theory was simpler, that the Wisconsin attack awakened something. That belief turned him from idea into echo, and now, echo into entity. The psychological explanation remains the official one. Two girls, delusional, isolated, feeding off a digital fantasy. But the aftermath felt different. The woods felt quieter. The forums got colder. People stopped posting stories for a while, not out of boredom, but fear. Because what if stories weren't harmless? What if we weren't writing him? What if he was reading us? There is a certain type of person drawn to monsters, not for thrills, not for the spectacle, but for the patterns. These are the archivists, the deep divers, the online mythologists, the obsessive catalogers of modern folklore. When Slender Man emerged, they didn't just watch. They mapped. They traced timelines. They built databases of every known appearance, fictional and real. They weren't trying to prove he existed. They were trying to understand how something like him could be born and why he seemed to refuse death. One of the earliest was a user named Morlock. Between 2010 and 2013, he maintained a now-defunct site called digitaldreadindex.org, an archive dedicated to internet-born entities. His Slender Man section was extensive, tracking image uploads, timestamps, forum origins, comment chains. He cross-referenced early folklore from Germany and Eastern Europe with modern posts. But in late 2013, his entries became erratic. He began referencing symbols not shown on screen, speaking in footnotes to someone watching the log. His final upload was a blog post titled, "The face we gave him was never blank." After that, the site was wiped. Not just taken down, scrubbed. Even archive crawlers couldn't retrieve it. Other researchers followed. A Reddit user named Bitmas Kangol claimed to have found hidden metadata embedded in early Slender Man fan videos. Audio glitches that, when analyzed, spelled out phrases in Morse code. One translated message read, "Remember you remembered." She disappeared from the platform a week after posting her findings. Attempts to contact her returned only one email, an image attachment of a black tree with no leaves and dozens of small white eyes drawn around its base. No text, no context. An urban legend began to form among digital folklorists that the deeper you researched Slender Man, the closer he came. Not metaphorically, literally. Researchers joked about nosebleeds, electrical interference, or corrupted files, until too many of them stopped laughing. One documentary project, known as the Path Watchers, planned to investigate Slender Man as a cultural tulpa. Halfway through production, the lead editor reportedly suffered a breakdown. She claimed someone kept rearranging her edit timeline overnight. Not deleting, reordering, always placing trees and static just before cuts of children laughing. The project was shelved indefinitely. Some researchers turned their focus to the Slender Man forums themselves. Certain threads, they noticed, had usernames that didn't exist elsewhere. No posting history, no email trace. But these accounts always posted at strange hours, often between 3 and 4 a.m., and often in riddles or reverse text. One such post read, "The puppet does not speak. The string is the whisper." Users who responded to those posts sometimes found their accounts locked out the next day, their inboxes wiped. A myth developed that there was a mirror version of Slender Man lore, a version not posted in public forums, but shared between accounts that only existed in the margins. Names that weren't usernames, scripts that didn't register as text, and those who saw too much of it stopped participating, not dramatically, quietly, they just left. Whether any of this is true is impossible to verify. But what's undeniable is that Slender Man changed something in the way people research folklore. He taught a generation that belief isn't always passive, that reading a story can be a form of summoning, that looking too closely at the mask invites the mask to look back. The archivists weren't afraid of Slender Man. They were afraid of what came after they realized he was still updating, that his myth was still growing, shifting, adapting, as if something intelligent was behind it, not a person, but a presence, a structure, a hive of thought and dread. And what made it worse? Some began to suspect that not all the stories were fan fiction. Some read like memory. The easiest way to explain Slender Man is to dismiss him, a modern myth, a creepypasta gone too far, a tragic case of digital hysteria amplified by the echo chambers of the internet. And on paper, that's all he is. Pixels, stories, a faceless mannequin draped in fear. But that explanation feels hollow when you look too long into the patterns, too clean, too convenient, because myths aren't born that fast, and they don't behave like him. Slender Man didn't just rise. He invaded. He adapted. He stitched himself into older folklore, blurred the line between fiction and faith, and taught a generation that fear doesn't need evidence. It just needs repetition. He was the first global campfire story told by flickering screens instead of flames. And yet, his shadow doesn't behave like a story's ending. It lingers. What makes him truly unsettling isn't how he looks. It's how he spreads, not through sightings or screams, but through ideas, through games, through jokes, through whispers online. He isn't conjured by blood or sacrifice, but by attention, by curiosity, by remembering. Every person who clicks, who wonders, who reads too late at night becomes a thread in his pattern. That's the genius of his design. He doesn't hunt. He waits. In an age where we digitize everything, thoughts, fears, rituals, it makes sense that something would digitize back. That an archetype, faceless and ancient, would find a body made of code. And maybe that's what Slender Man really is. Not a monster, but a vessel. Not an invention, but an opening. The shape of a fear we've always had, given new language, new form. A mask worn by the idea that something is always watching just beyond the trees. So whether you believe he's real doesn't matter. Enough people did. And belief has power. It always has. That's why we burn incense. That's why we whisper names. That's why we build stories around silence. Because we know deep down that not all fiction stays where we leave it. In the end, maybe Slender Man is just the face we gave something we've never wanted to name. Something that grows in the cracks between fear and fascination. Something that learns by watching what we fear. And if you've ever looked at the woods and felt like something was staring back, not moving, not speaking, just knowing, then maybe you already understand. Maybe he was never coming. Maybe he was already here.